Well, yeah, and also
Yeah.
a lot of things about science fiction from, like, shall we say, 1936 on, like when C.L. Moore became a writer,
Yeah.
up until 71 or 72, was that up until that point it was an underground literature. After it reached a certain point, and Star Trek was in large part responsible for this, it became an above ground literature, and so it was no longer a rebellious literature.
Okay.
And so that really, but I mean, because if you look at the female writers like Kit Reed, Judith Merrill, Margaret St. Clair, at their best, they were just as bleak and as bitter and as cynical as Fred Poe and C.N. Kornbluth, and in some ways, they were even
Well, speaking
bleaker.
of semantics, I just want to toss something out here for a second.
Oh, toss it back.
I took an interesting class over at UCLA on the brain and human intelligence, and there's some work being done there having to do with logic systems, in which it looks like logic patterns may be tied in with deep emotion, which is a really interesting idea, because there's been an attempt in our culture to really so narrowly define people as to say men are logical doers and women are the emotional feel-gooders, and they're finding out that our brains are not working like that. They don't. I mean, there is an emotional impulse which causes a certain logic pattern to form and take place. And so I'm challenging you, Steve, that maybe this idea of men, yes, we portrayed them in the past like that men are the doers and they're entirely logical and vice versa. I honestly don't think that's necessarily true. And I think it's going to be, I think it has to be and will be reflected in our literature.
Okay, now, I think that it is good to challenge it. I think that the only degree to which it is valid is that it is a tendency, it is a slight tendency, but noticeable over a statistical sampling, but that if what you're trying to say is that men don't, people have taken that to the ridiculous extreme of men not feeling, which is an absurdity, because they did the other extreme too, women don't think, which is another absurdity. But on the other hand, it makes a certain amount of sense to think that function and form are interrelated, that the widely differing reproductive strategies of men and women might result in some differences in the way they perceive reality. There are wild differences in that particular aspect, even though the differences in other aspects get more and more trivial. There, it's major. And I think that it creates, if we were talking about blues and greens, and that the blues and greens could decide between them which of them was going to was going to get pregnant and raise the baby, and sometimes it was a blue and sometimes it was a green, then it would be reasonable to say, well, look, guys, it's kind of ridiculous to say that the greens have this characteristic and the blues have that one. But because women are always the ones whose bodies hold the children.
We go back to biological determinism.
Yeah, that there is an aspect, and it may only be responsible for a 1% shift. I mean, I don't think it's a huge thing, but I think that sociobiology has some validity to it. If you don't take a look at it as being the whole toolbox, it's kind of absurd to consider that a function is central to human survival, as that would not leave its mark somewhere in the psychology of the groups. I don't think that it's not a majority of it, but I think that it is enough that a lot of mythology is built around it, a lot of rigidity is built around it, and people get simplistic enough to say that these small differences are big ones. This is what men are, and this is what women are, and they're kind of missing the fact that men and women are human beings.
Well, you were talking about building characters, and this framework of rigidity or intense flexibility, depending on what your intellectual background has been and what kind of exploration you've done. I think that that's one of the first steps in creating a character.
Is
if you're going to, for example, when I create a male character and I sit down and think about it, I have to think about, first of all, my assumptions about men.
What are they?
That they're strong, and they're stronger than I am physically, more powerful, better at math.
All
and a
these
lot
things
of
are not necessarily true,
No, that's what I'm
It's
saying.
true.
But they're tends
You
to.
asked me what my
got it.
personal assumptions were about men. About difference in ability to focus physical energy, different priorities in tasking. These are some of the things that I think about when I'm thinking about a male character. How I personally get around it is first of all, I watch men. I'm very voyeuristic, and I watch not a man just sits by himself, but how men interact with other people. And I have to tell you that I don't see that the stereotype that I thought at first,
Which is?
Which is that men are only interested in the physical and they're only interested in the intellectual and some of the things that I thought were very, very wrong. So that's a valuable tool. It is the same tools that an actor brings to a task.
So what differences do you think are there? If there were not the big differences that you thought were there, what differences do you think are there?
Oh, well, besides between being an innie or an outie, having to do with sexual.
Right. Right.
Let me think about that and come back to you.
And so, Sandy, where do you sit on the issue of
Wait,
what?
I just remembered the big one.
Revelation.
Okay, big
The
one.
big
Big
one.
one.
The big one. Physical presence. Men don't have any fear about filling their space. Even if they're heavy, they can take up room and they feel comfortable with it. I watch women, including myself, minimize themselves in a room and decorate the place that they're in.
True.
Men will move their legs apart very comfortably. Men will take large strides. I mean, they will physically occupy the space that they're in.
Yeah.
I think that's very different from women. I think
Yeah.
women are very careful to move out of the way so that there's room for everyone and to really think about it in a room, making sure, I found myself doing this at dinner one night going, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl. Good, everybody has somebody to talk to. None of the guys would think about something like that. I don't think, that's my assumption, would be worrying about the idea that there's men and women and other people to talk to in the physical space. So that's an orientation, physical presence. That's, I think, is a difference that sometimes I will bring.
Okay, Sandy.
Yeah, that's very interesting because just about the time I think I was about 12, 13, you started noticing the differences. My girlfriend and I noticed how...
Oh, just a second.
Oh,
I
whoops, wait a minute.
wanted to give our... This is KPFK 90.7 FM, Radio Los Angeles, and we're on Mike Odell's Hour 25 here with our guests, Karen Wilson and Art Cover, and my co-host, Sandy Reimer, and I am your host, Steve Barnes. Now, back to your regularly scheduled programming. Yay!
What a doer, what a doer.
Well, now that I've totally...
I can't just be.
now that
go
I've
ahead.
totally forgotten what I was going to say.
Okay.
No, it was very interesting because we started noticing
Physical presence.
The physical presence. Yeah, that the guys walked differently, sat differently, moved different, and so we started mimicking them to see how it felt. It was very strange. First of all, we're built differently, so we can't really walk like the guys. I had sore muscles the next day. But, just
You guys are sore all the time.
Oh, are they
That's why they
really?
like to
Oh,
get
it's-
stroked so
Oh,
much.
I see. Oh, dear. Yeah, it's like...
I wake up stiff every morning. I'm really sore.
Here's something else to consider in terms of a male character. This might spark you, Sandy.
I want to say something really bad. Go ahead. Never mind.
Men's placement and presentation of physical objects in a room.
Uh-huh.
Women will decorate a house in order to glorify what she thinks and feels and who's important to her, and to be constantly reminded in little displays of beauty. Okay.
Oh, yes.
Many men that I have met do not live in their apartments.
Right.
They don't live in their rooms. They store their stuff there. It's stashed, and there's an occasional picture, so mommy has something to look at when she shows up. But they
Yeah.
don't live there. They live out in the world. They don't live in that physical space, and that's a big difference.
Yeah,
between men
I
and
just
women.
moved, and excuse me, person who's out there listening to all this, but we moved in, and I was very concerned. It's like everything had to be in its proper place, and I had to have things on the wall, and I had to beautify. I had to make a presence, a statement. I had to make it this way. And he never had an idea of what I was doing, simply because that's just not where he was thinking. It's like he would bring things in and sort of put them in his room, and that was fine. I tried to let go. I tried to let him just do that because I was beginning to really notice this difference. That as long as he knew where things were, that was fine. Me, I had to put the plants up and the pictures up and make sure that the couch was reupholstered and and all this
Well, that's why men
stuff.
keep moving around, because they'll do all that stuff.
Okay.
You don't have to think about it.
Is that what
you
they're
know.
for? I was
Yeah,
trying to figure
yeah.
that
What
out.
a-
Yeah, no, so Art,
That's why so many men are interior decorators and makes hundreds of thousands of dollars versus women in the field. Go on.
Yeah,
but
Yeah.
but
But
we
they
know
won't
what.
be in the military.
Yes, yeah, that's right. It's very interesting to
It is.
note the sports, for instance, that are being the activities in which are being ravaged by AIDS. I was reading that figure skating is. Okay, I bet speed skating isn't. I bet you that there is a higher proportion of homosexuals among divers than among swimmers who swim for time. for instance, among bodybuilders than among powerlifters. In other words, once again, display as opposed to performance.
But
Yeah,
throughout,
I gotcha.
throughout the arts, age is,
Yeah, well, the arts are pure display.
Right.
There
That's
is no
true.
Oh, yeah.
objective measurement in art.
yeah.
Okay. So anyway, speaking of objective measurements in art, what is
yeah.
your objective measurement of the
Yeah,
difference
well,
between men and women?
I think if I really told people, they might object. You know?
Well, hurry up, because I have another point. Come on,
Okay,
Art.
go ahead with
No.
that.
I want to hear
No.
what you consider in terms of creation of a character, or what differences do you kind of across the board expect to
Okay,
find
actually-
between men and women?
I sort of thought about how I handled it, and when I first started writing professionally, women weren't really like a big. I mean, since you told me this is what we're going to talk about, I actually gave it some thought. You know, when I started writing in the '70s professionally, women weren't really part of my life. I mean, I didn't date, I didn't hang out with them, I didn't socialize with them.
Did you have a mother?
Yeah, but she didn't count. She was
Okay.
mom. You know. But I was very antisocial in a lot of ways, and so I just didn't really think about having a social life of any sort. In fact, I rebelled against the very concept. So women in my early fiction tended to be icons. The major female characters in my first 3 books that got published was somebody who was sort of like, she started out the book as a Helen Keller character, was cured, but then something tragic happened to her because of the very method that she was cured. In the 80s in my work, I noticed that, I mean, after I was married and was like a little bit more comfortable socializing, the purpose of women or their motivation and their purpose within the story changed, and they became much more characters rather than icons. I mean, they would still be icons, because if you're telling a love story, like Martin Eden, Jack London's book, is like the female character at the first part of the book is an icon. She represents middle class success, all the things that this character doesn't have. The only thing he's got is his knowledge and his talent and his literary ambition. But at the end of the book, when he's successful and her family is impoverished, then she becomes interested in him, and she becomes an icon of an entirely different purpose. But and so there's always that aspect of the character of the opposite sex of your protagonist, depending on what the function of the story
I'd like
is.
to make a comment that relates to what you just said. It is a stereotype, but it is true to a degree that people had better take this into account when they go looking for relationships. That physical attractiveness is to women as money is to men. And people make that is such a common judgment call that gets made, that women who look at men who have potential but refuse to use it, are too lazy to use it, or too have emotional hang-ups and can't keep jobs and so forth, that guy is worth nothing on the dating market, okay? As opposed to a guy who maybe has limited capacity but uses every inch of it, that guy has no problem finding women be attracted to him. A woman who does the absolute best with whatever level of physical beauty she has, she really pushes it, she's really trying, that woman will find relationships as well. But a woman who is just not interested in taking care of herself in that particular way, she will often have the same problems finding a relationship that a guy who is simply lazy about getting a job will find. That there is that difference. Women
They may get together.
Women do not get more attractive as they become more successful.
I think that's something else that's changing.
I think it is changing as well.
I think if you ask a woman what she looks for in a man, she looks for someone who does what they say they're going to do, who will communicate, who you can trust, and who will not fall apart and do nothing.
That doesn't contradict with what I said.
Well,
actually.
no. First, you talked about women looking for men who are physically attractive.
No, I said men look
powerful.
for women who are physically attractive.
Oh, okay.
Women look for men who are powerful.
Yeah, I was going to say, I misheard you there.
Yeah, every guy knows that if he gets a raise, he gets more powerful, he gets a promotion, he becomes more sexually attractive. Every
That's
guy
why
knows
there's,
that.
that's why there's
Guys
so much
out
sexual
there who want
harassment, though,
women,
because if they
talk
think
about
that, like,
your dreams
they have
and
powerful,
your goals, and
Yes.
talk about what you believe in.
Yes.
And if you say you're going to do something, do it. And
That's
you
right.
will have more women following you and interested in you
And-
than you can believe.
Well, women complain about men, who judge them by their physical beauty, and men complain about women who judge them by how much money they make. And these are the stereotypic complaints that they make. And women say, it is degrading for me to to me measured only by my physical attractiveness, and men say it is
Right.
degrading for me to be measured by how much money I make.
But why I think that's changing is that we're moving into a society in which the upward mobility simply isn't there that we had and for the past 500 years.